So we're going to talk about the welfare effects of economic migration. And economic migration is defined as movement of labor where the individual has considered the costs and benefits of making that move. It can be seen as an investment on the part of an individual in the same way that, say, investing in an education is. It has nothing to do with people who flee unstable environments, refugees. So it doesn't have anything to do with that. These are people who are moving for economic reasons. And economic migration, of course, is spurred by observed wage differences between many countries. And you can see, for example, in the US, wages are very high relative to one of the neighbors, Mexico. I made those numbers up. But let's suppose, there is a substantial difference. And as you would expect, people will seek to move from Mexico to the US in search of better wages. And what that does is it puts downward pressure on the wages in the United States. There's sort of an issue with where do we put the migrants, which actually turns out to be more than just practical, because is the well-being of the migrants something that is enjoyed in the US because that's where they are when they enjoy the new higher wages, or is it something that should be accruing to Mexico, possibly because people send remittances home? But anyway, we'll assume that migration puts downward pressure on wages in the US, and perhaps wages fall. Let's have them go down from, say, I can't do it with a ruler, I'll put that in later, maybe from 10 down to 7 or something. And that people leave Mexico, and I'm going to show that by moving my supply curve in Mexico. And so that's the thing about where should I put the migrants. But we're going to show the Mexican supply curve net of migrants. So these are the people who get left behind after some people move to the United States. So we'll call that the supply curve of the remainers, the people who stayed behind. And so the people between these two supply curves then are the migrants. They're sort of they're in between these two curves, and I'll show that in a minute. But people leaving Mexico and moving to the United States, of course, puts upward pressure on the wages in Mexico. So people who stay behind, if you like your country, but the wages are rather low, you kind of want to hope somebody else leaves to put upward pressure on your wages. But we will suppose that the amount of people who have moved over to the United States are such that maybe wages in Mexico rise. Let's make up some numbers. So let's say they go up to perhaps $5, and wages in the US are pushed downwards by the influx of new workers from Mexico. So wages in the US fall by $3 down to $7. And you might at first think, well, why with arbitrage aren't the wages equalized in the two countries? And it's because that there are costs of migration. There are monetary costs associated with migration and living in a foreign country, and then there are psychic costs of not having access to normal relationships with families and things like that. So if we find ourselves in a long run equilibrium situation where we have a persistent $2 gap between wages in Mexico and wages in the US, assuming workers are free to leave, then this $2 represents the hourly cost of migration. And what that means from a practical point of view is that workers in Mexico regard $5 earned in Mexico as worth the same amount to them as $7 earned in the United States. So the $2 covers the costs associated with migration. And then, of course, as we always do, we will be looking at the welfare implications of this migration. The demand curve for workers in the US is represents we can look at that area under the demand curve and above the wage line as representing the surplus, if you like, enjoyed by the demanders or the employers of labor in the US. And so following the same lettering of the book, if we call this area A and B, you can see that when the wages fall from $10 down to $7, US employers gain A plus B. And we can also see why migration's controversial, because if you are a worker or a supplier of labor in the US, you can see that the fall in the wages from $10 down to $7 causes a loss to the workers of Area A. So US workers, not counting the migrants, the original US workers, lose A. And so you can see too, just as you would expect, it's an overall positive as long as you don't mind the fact that the employers have gained and the existing American workers have lost, and you might mind that deeply, especially if you're an existing American worker. But from the point of view of the $1 one vote metric, this is a gain to the United States, the additional workers. And then if we go over to the Mexican situation, and I need one more line here. We need to look at the migrants too. So that is actually an interesting question. They're in the Mexican diagram, but now they're living in the United States. So do we count their well-being as part of the US's well-being, or do we count it as part of Mexico's well-being? Especially if they send remittances, then obviously at least part of it constitutes an increase in well-being for Mexico. And in fact, Mexican governments historically have been very supportive of migration because of the positive effect of migrant remittances on the Mexican economy. All right, so that's in the US. So then in Mexico, let's see who we've got here. Let's do the simple one. We've got employers, Mexican employers. So Mexico, the employers lose because they have fewer workers and they have to pay them more money. So we have a loss of the area under the demand curve and between the two prices. So they used to be able to get workers for $2.50, now they have to pay $5. So that area is D plus E. So D plus E is a negative for the employers in Mexico. And then how about the remaining workers, the people who say bye, see you later? This is almost the easy thing. The remaining workers get to enjoy higher wages because they have less competition in the labor market. And so if you're a remaining worker in Mexico, this is the supply curve net of the migrants. You can see that these workers above their supply curve, they get to enjoy extra welfare surplus of D. So they gain D. And then the migrants, who we've got in the Mexican diagram, the migrants also gain because they get to gain areas E plus F. So if the total gain to all workers is D, E, and F, D is the remaining workers, E and F, this area between the two supply curves, these are the migrants. So the migrants gain E plus F. And in equilibrium, a worker making $5 in the US, $5 in Mexico considers him or herself as well off as a worker making $7 in the United States. So what we got here, we got to look at our little triangles. We've got Mexican employers lose D plus E, remaining workers gain D. The E that is lost by the employers goes to the migrants. So the overall effect here is plus F. So that's an overall effect. So the world as a whole gains the US's gains plus the Mexican gains, so they gain B. The world as a whole gains B plus F. So in a very simplistic way, migration of workers from places where workers are cheap to places where workers are better rewarded has the usual positive welfare effects of sort of rearranging things and sending them to where they're most needed. But of course, people are not apples or oranges, and there are real human costs and benefits associated with migration that the book does a very nice job of talking about. And we also have some videos in this week's course materials where you can find out some of the more human side of migration. But this is the simple welfare effects of economic migration.